Hey everybody. So Andrew Liddell is coming. This is classic. He said that his computer started updating when he turned it on to meet with us. And that was about 5-ish minutes ago. So hopefully it's not too long. Topic is going to be related to EdTech. And I'll just have a few opening remarks till he gets here regarding EdTech. If you were here earlier in the morning in USA time, Heidi spoke. And Heidi Sass talked a little bit about the EdTech platforms and the things behind them. But one thing that happened around Christmas time that was really interesting was the whole Power School thing. Now, an anecdote is that my dad uses Power School. He's a special ed teacher, and he totally got hacked. His students got hacked. And I think that was the first time he realized the work that I do and what I work on for that. So it's happening more and more often as we're seeing, and the implications of the student data and how it's being used, how it's being transferred, the partners they're sharing with it are really big, important issues that, many of us here have addressed or look to address going forward. One of our previous panelists, Sue Atkins, also does some very interesting things in the UK. Basically, what she's found is kind of showing evidence of delaying the devices, but to do it, you need like social context. So the whole point of that is working with parents to say, hey, we're not going to get our kids a phone by age 8 or by age X, and then from there, saying that these are certain apps that we are not going to allow until this age or not allow at all. Because then you have community coming together and students have that social need. So if they're outside of that social sphere, like one parent says, hey, no phone, no this, no that, then they're excluded socially. And we know from development, especially like preteens to teenagers, they tend to take more stock in their outside influences rather than the home. So they vie for affection, friendships, and various in-groups. So they need to be a part of those. It's a very important part of development. And so kind of looking at how children are raised, it's through this community lens, right? Like it takes a village to raise a child, but that community lens is really important when we look at how to fix these types of things. Then there are people like Jasper, who is in charge of the Chromebook case. He's the original person who talked about this in Denmark, where he found that basically the entire system in Denmark is using Google apps, including the Chromebook. And that data, whether or not a parent has any say in it, gets siphoned to Google as an example. And so there's 2 areas related to this. And the whole purpose of looking at this from those lenses of like community, what can we do as a community of people? And then what do we do on the hardcore tech side of things? And a lot of that has to be regarded with legislation. And it's a global problem. One thing that Jasper has constantly told me about is that, yes, it's a global problem, but a lot of these organizations and a lot of the laws are ruled in the US. And the US has allowed these tech companies. So when we look at addressing this, we need to hold other governments accountable that are, letting edtech companies from the US come in, but there's also a lot of US regulation that doesn't exist. And we need to be vocal about that, inside the US as well. So those are 2 really broad themes in the edtech space. It's easier said than done, but there's been a lot of light, as Tiffany was saying, regarding, the anxious generation, Jonathan Haidt's examples. So people are aware of the effects. More and more people are aware of these effects. The answer is definitely going to be nuanced in a lot of ways. There's going to be give and take. And when you're affecting the dollars of a corporation, there's going to be a fight. And it's not going to be easy, but we know that the best interest is in our future, our children, and making sure that they are learning, problem solving, and developing in the proper ways that they should be. So there's also one thing that Heidi mentioned about how, EdTech takes the data of students and, the staff, and a lot of that information gets siphoned, which violates rules of, children under 13 as an example, and their data is put in HR software as an example. So there's a lot of very, nuanced things about how that data is spreading. And so each one of these, like, literally could be its own seminar, and it could be the entire conference in itself. So we are really looking from these various facets and lenses. Now, one thing that I specialize in is privacy. So, for example, going back to December where PowerSchool was hacked, all of this very sensitive data of children is collected. And AI has opened new, what we call threat vectors. It's still coming out. I work on the field. We serve about, my foundation serves about 30 million children. We work with Child Fund internationally. And what we found is that, on the field, we're also working with survivors of abuse as well. But on the field, what we're finding is that people are really innovative with how to use AI to take advantage of people, right? And that research isn't going to come out until later because it takes time. There's delays in understanding and quantifying and all that stuff. But when you're on the field, there's a real sense of urgency. And the data hacks make it very easy to put tons of data into a LLM or a suite of them, as you may have seen with Ali Howe's presentation. And it's really easy to identify weak links based on socioeconomic status. You can do zip code, you can do single family household, those types of things that actually target children. They can target people, they can for stalking and various things like that. And what we found internationally is that, yes, of course, there's sex trafficking of minors, but there's also like hard labor of minors as well. And so we're seeing this, in East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, various places, South America too, where people are taking advantage of. And a lot of that data of students is, held by just a couple of companies, which are owned by for-profit VC funding entities as well. So that is sort of how things are developing and what it looks like in this space. When I've talked to Heidi as well, she's sort of mentioned that the Federal Trade Commission has really hammered down on privacy violations, which is good. They seem to be outside of tech, so like hotel companies, some, leakage of data that's like really obvious. However, a big problem in the US is that individuals can't sue. It's usually the attorney general of that state that provides a fine for those organizations. There's a lot of lobbying not to make that, like in Vermont, for example. And the reason I built a nonprofit based on this was because I am not trusting that the US can enact legislation quickly enough or thoroughly enough, especially and even proactively enough, right? Like, let's say it takes 2 years to get something for AI. Well, AI will look so different than what it was when that bill was starting to be passed. And at least in America, we have a long time for, it takes about 7 years after a law is introduced for like the norm of how that law functions to be really used in case law. Meaning basically there's been rulings for 7 years after it's been created. So let's say it gets created today. In about 7 years, there's going to be a norm because a lot of companies are figuring out what they can get away with legally, what they can't get. And there's, with words, there's different religions that all look at the same book, right? The same Bible, but they view things so differently, or sects of religions. So even with a clear law, there's interpretations of that and constitutional interpretations of that. And so now you have to wait like 7 years, not saying that things won't be introduced, but it does take that long for an established record of cases, landmark cases, to really provide the ability for people to understand. Oh, yay, Andrew's here.
Hi, everybody. Hey, John, thanks for covering for me.
Hey, Nate, you had a very relatable thing that's happened to everybody, though.
I hope so. Yeah, I don't think they're out to get me, but it felt like that. Good to see everybody today. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And John, again, thanks for covering. My name is Andy Liddell. I'm a lawyer and co-founder of the EdTech Law Center here in Austin, Texas. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the privacy and other harms that kids are facing on their school computers. And so I will try and go through this a little bit quickly. I wanted to talk to you all about any questions you may have. But the short of it is, kids are going to school, and certainly here in the United States and a lot of other countries, education has moved largely on computers, even when kids are present at school. And this is leading to a lot of harms. There's invasions of privacy, which is what we're going to focus on today, as well as other harms like those to health and wellness, unhealthy engagement or compulsive use, data insecurity, commercial manipulation of kids, discrimination against kids, racial and otherwise, no access from schools or these edtech providers to even what programs kids are using at school, and also access to inappropriate content such as pornography and ultra-violent videos. But we're going to talk about invasions of privacy, and then we'll conclude with some of the other harms. And so, a shocking statistic: 96% of apps that are used at school share kids' personal information with third parties. That is a shocking figure. And the question really is, how is this possible? Um, People understand, and I think this is part of the problem, that kids, certainly in the United States, do have strong privacy rights. There's several laws, but two main ones that are protective of kids' rights in their information, both on and offline and at school. So there's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998, or COPPA, and there's also the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. We'll talk about those two each on their own. So COPPA, passed in 1998, it governs basically business uses of information of kids under 13. So whatever a web operator is doing, there are very strict limitations on what companies can take from kids without verified parental consent. And so the key provision of this law is that, with a few very, very narrow exceptions, companies must obtain verifiable parental consent before they collect any information on kids under 13. This law, there is no private right of action. It can only be enforced by state attorneys general and the Federal Trade Commission. The other law that protects kids online is FERPA, and FERPA governs schools' use and disclosure of student education records. And this came about after Vietnam, and schools were basically leaking information of student radicals and things. And so, as part of the rights revolution of the 70s, this law was passed to protect students of all ages from the disclosure of their education records. Again, schools are not to disclose education records except in very limited circumstances. One of those circumstances is to a school official or somebody that the school hires that would otherwise be doing something that the school itself would do. And so the paradigm case back in the 70s was, say you take your kids on a field trip to a museum and you want to tell the museum docent the kids' names. Well, technically, without this exception, that would be a violation of FERPA. And so the docent is deemed to be a school official for the purposes of the field trip, and you can tell that person the kids' names when otherwise you couldn't. This law also, no private right of action, enforceable only by the education department. And so you might be asking, if we have these great laws protecting kids' privacy, how are 96% of apps used at school taking kids' data? And it's because the edtech industry has turned these laws inside out, and because the private enforcement agencies have not really done their part in enforcing these provisions against edtech companies. And so let's talk about these two loopholes. The COPPA loophole that companies have, advocated for, even though there's not really any basis in the law for it, is that essentially the school may consent on behalf of the parent or over the parent's objections. And this loophole was cobbled together through selective quotations of things that are not the law or its implementing regulation, but essentially blog posts and commentary that's associated with the adoption of the law, but not the law itself. The law itself has nothing in the statute that mentions schools or agency or anything else. And so there is no basis in the law for this, but the entire edtech industry is propped up on this, I would say, willful misapprehension of the law. And even when they talk about it, they confuse some pretty fundamental legal principles of agency and conservatorship. And so back when this was passed, there was some commentary that schools could act as parents' agents for the purpose of obtaining consent. So that means the school could go out on the parent's behalf and actually get consent from the parent after informing the parent of whatever the technology platform is going to take from their kid. Well, over time and over many years of non-enforcement of this provision, business has taken it to mean that really schools act as parents' conservators, that parents don't have any rights. They don't have any decision-making ability, and it's the schools who can do this in parents' place over their objection. And that's just not what the law requires, although that's how these companies are operating. As far as FERPA, EdTech contracts with schools deem themselves to be school officials. So therefore, the school can disclose all education records to them, and they also describe everything that they collect as an education record. And therefore, what they say is that this information belongs to the school and not the student, even though it's the student's name and birthday and social security number and home address and many other things that are personal to that student, their health records. Under this loophole, EdTech companies act like this information belongs to the school and not to the student. But this still didn't even get them there, because even under that provision, school officials are not authorized to further share education records. And courts have interpreted education records to be a very narrow category of information. And so it simply isn't the case that everything a company managed to connive to collect at school is an education record. But that's how these companies are operating. And again, it's an extremely disingenuous argument, because when one of these massive educational systems is hacked, it's not school information that is being taken. It is personal information about kids that is being taken. And so that is the lay of the land right now in terms of the laws in the United States and the weaknesses with EdTech's interpretation of them. I understand that not everybody here is in the US, so I wanted to at least touch on a few other elements that might be relevant in your own jurisdiction where you may lack the laws that we have. I'm a US lawyer, and so I don't have insight into every other country's way of doing things. But one thing that we're attacking in our work is consent. And consent is a pretty fundamental legal concept that has a number of requirements. We'll talk about three of them. So consent, for it to be valid, has to be voluntary, it has to be informed, and it has to be authorized. And so what that means is that you can't give consent involuntarily, right? Forced consent is no consent at all. But when you think about school and the school environment, kids have to be there. The law makes their parents send them there. They have to be at school. And so the element of voluntariness simply is not met. Likewise, the informed element is not met either. Parents are never informed. Schools often aren't informed about what platforms are even being used in the classroom and what information is being taken from kids, and much less how that information is being used or stored, such that people could have an informed basis on which to provide their consent. And so the informed aspect is missing as well. And authorized is basically the consent has to come from a person who's authorized to give it. And so I can't bind someone else to a contract simply by saying I bind them to a contract. I have to have a legal relationship with that third party for that to be valid. So in this sense, there is no legal relationship between parents and schools that would allow the schools to consent on behalf of the parents. And likewise, if companies were to try and get consent from kids themselves, well, minors under the age of 18 in the US, and I think most places, they are not authorized to give consent. They are not at the age of majority, and so their parents are the ones that have to provide that consent. And one other key aspect where I think that a lot of this falls apart is in contract formation. And so we have consent as one piece, but then for a contract to be valid, there has to be consideration. And it's this legal concept, but essentially it's the benefit of the bargain. It's the thing that you're getting out of the agreement. And whatever you're getting can't be a thing you're already entitled to. And so here, the idea that a company can enter into a contract with a kid, even assuming everything else away, well, the fact is, if this company is standing between this kid and his education to which he's legally entitled, that's not valid consideration for a contract, because that child is already entitled to that education. And so they must be given, the child must be given something else other than the education to which they're entitled for that to be valid. For example, if a company were to fully inform a child's parents about what they were doing with the information and then pay them for it, that would theoretically be a valid contract. And so all of this gets down to the problem with EdTech, which it's a market, not a product. The same companies that are behind Silicon Valley are behind EdTech. The Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative have funded and founded companies in the EdTech space for the better part of the last 15 years. And Apple, Google obviously have major market penetration with their hardware, with Chromebooks and with iPads. And so these companies, they're not designing products with kids' best interest at heart. They're not starting with a blank page and working in close consult with child behavioral specialists to decide what's good for a kindergartner, what's good for a third grader, what's good for a kid in junior high, and what's good for someone in high school. They're not doing any of that at all. They're starting with products that frankly couldn't sell or that they wanted to sell in other markets and were able to foist them onto public education. Chromebook was not a successful product until it found the education market. And iPads too had hit something of a plateau by the time that they were themselves foisted onto the education market. And so the result is clear. When you don't design things that educate kids, the academic performance fails. And so as learning has moved to computers, academic performance has fallen every single year since 2012, which is the year that one-to-one programs first began to gain widespread adoption. And so, the EdTech Law Center, what we would like to help usher in is a complete reimagining of technology at school. If the current paradigm is where kids are learning core subjects on computers, and in doing so, they're not learning the core subjects or how to use computers very well, we envision an explicit teaching of about modern technology. And so telling kids about where do computers come from? How did these even start? How have computers been used over the past essentially 200 plus years from their origins in the factories of the English Midlands on through today, where the surveillance business model has been developed, helping kids understand what these companies want from them when they use a computer. Um, I would also teach kids how to recognize persuasive design or coercive design that manipulates people into staying on and using products much longer than they otherwise would voluntarily. The mark of persuasive design is just this exploitative business model that intends to monetize attention and maximize time on device. That is not a hallmark of a tool. A tool sits there. It doesn't want anything for you. A hammer doesn't want to be held, but an app wants to be used because it gets something from you when that happens. And teach kids well before you ever sit them down in front of a computer the conceptual and problem solving skills that they would need and then how to use those computers as tools for creation and not simply as devices for consumption. Even as much of a critic as I am of the current edtech paradigm, I still believe that there is a place for technology in school. It just looks a lot different than the technology today. And I would say that there is very little place for today's technology in schools. To my earlier point, I would have providers account for kids' developmental stages and make misuse impossible at every age. And so at the EdTech Law Center, we work with a lot of families whose children have been exposed to pornography at school, for example, or who have seen ultra-violent content or are being cyberbullied, typically kids that are in middle school and, in every case, or sometimes elementary school. And in every case, the school blames the kid when this happens. They say, you shouldn't be using it this way. Well, I would say you shouldn't be making this possible for this to be used this way. Our textbooks don't come crammed with pages of pornography or depictions of violence. Kids aren't allowed to bring their own video game machines or slot machines to school. There's a lot that we don't countenance in the real world that simply because it's happening through a computer, we allow. I say no. I say no to that these companies must start with how kids actually are and what they actually need and design products to fit how kids really are and not just blame them for when someone gets hurt using their defectively designed products. I would also have companies consider ergonomic and physical health needs to minimize damage to kids' posture, their hands, their eyesight, and their weight. We know that there is a crisis of obesity around the world. A lot of that is driven by kids being sedentary, and kids being sedentary is in large part being driven by technology. 1 billion people are expected to have diagnosable nearsightedness or myopia by 2050. And the medical community attributes that directly to overuse of screens. And so I would say if you're a company trying to sell into the schools where you know that the average school day is 7 hours long, you need to design knowing that kids need to get up and move around, and that if they sit in front of these things too long, it will damage their eyesight. And finally, I would take student information off the cloud and out of companies' data lakes where it's used to build profiles of kids and minimize the future collection use of this information. Most of us got here without any of this ed tech in our lives or at our schools, and we're here. And so I would think that we did just fine. Our kids don't need this stuff. This is really for the benefit of private companies and Silicon Valley's bottom line. It's not for the benefit of kids. And so the future of EdTech in the classroom, I would say, looks a lot more like the past in the 90s, where you have a dedicated space with computers that are only out when you need them. And otherwise, we return to using things that we know have worked for a long time: pens, paper, relationship with your teachers, and relationships with each other. And so you can find us at edtech.law. I'm Andy Liddell. And if you or you know somebody who has a problem where education meets technology, we're here to help. And so apologies for that being a little bit rushed. I concluded right on time and would happily stick around for any questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. If people have questions, we have 15 minutes till the next session, so you have some time if you want to ask anything. One comment that I really thought I thought about when you mentioned the physical needs too, right? Like I'm a tech person. I think of like how the technology is affecting them mentally, but yeah, the physical aspect of it is huge. And America at least is very sedentary in a lot of ways. In the school system, like you're just sitting down all day and looking at screens. So
Yeah, you're sitting at a desk. Like you're not sitting with an ergonomic keyboard and a chair.
yeah.
Right? It's like you're just hunched over a laptop or an iPad. If it was in a workplace, it would be a workplace health and safety violation, but it's in school. And so, different laws seem to apply.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Thank you, Angeline.
Yeah, hi. I came because you can't hear me from the other side. Because Andrew and I, we were talking before the conference, and what I really like about what you're doing, yeah, trying to get those devices, proven that they have to make these devices, is that then it exists, right? And you can be really on the forefront of uh, saving children, basically in the whole world, right? Trying to force, and I really hope that you're successful, because it force for children worldwide that they can really learn with proper devices. Once you prove it in America, then they can easily be followed, I think, in other geographies.
That's certainly the hope. I mean, we've seen that, what starts here kind of rolls out to other countries. And so, I absolutely do hope that we can make change here in the US so that everyone else gets the benefit of this. And, that other countries, they have different education systems than ours. They're much more centralized. And so one thing that I have found inspiring, the government of Sweden has started to pull out EdTech from its classrooms, calling it a failed experiment. And so in countries where they have more centralized education systems, it might be much more, I guess, easier to de-adopt this stuff and to pull it out of schools, rather than here where it's a district by district kind of thing. And so I think we should be looking to the likes of Sweden, who is, reversed course and acknowledged its mistake, and countries in East Asia where they really have been reluctant to adopt a lot of the one-to-one paradigm that we see here in the US and other Western countries.
Edith, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Edith from Zimbabwe. She would like to know your thoughts about AI companies like OpenAI offering educator training programs on the use of AI. Could this be a reflection of a shift in their attitudes, or is it a way to maintain the race to market and possibly create monopolies of sorts?
Yes, I think AI has no place in school, period. Certainly, if it's generative AI like OpenAI, ChatGPT, things like this, they don't belong in school. You see edtech companies that are trying to chase the AI hype bubble and talking about all of their AI products. But we've seen, and we'll hear later on at this conference, devastating stories about children who get into these emotional relationships with AI characters. They'll ask AI all kinds of things that end up disclosing very sensitive information about their home life, or possibly their sexuality, or medical conditions they might have, things that you might want to confide in a therapist or a trusted adult or a friend, but that you wouldn't want some company having, only to use it against you later. Um, I see AI in the classroom, and frankly, I see this whole EdTech project as as an attack on the teaching profession, a way to deprofessionalize teaching and basically put tech at the center and the forefront, and not the human relationships that we know kids need to thrive in school.
I love that answer. That was really insightful. And talking so much about AI in education, but yeah, from your lens, it just makes absolute sense, right? It needs to be friendly for children, and that's simply not. It needs to be safe. As you said, I keep saying this to people. So, like you said to me, you wouldn't put like a piece of playground equipment inside a school that will break, and no one's responsible for it, right? So,
Right. Yeah. Well, what I like to say, right? You wouldn't the playground company can't mail a kit of parts to the first grade class and have them put that together, and then when it collapses and kills a kid, blame the kids for doing it wrong. But tech companies are doing this every day. When a young child might be looking for medically accurate information on sex and ends up being directed to violent pornography, that's a company failure. That's not a kid failure.
I agree. I have both my parents are teachers and all their friends are teachers. My sister is a teacher. And just that shift for how much like they are supposed to now adopt to technology coming top down, right? Like you're using this is the program, you're doing all these things. There's a few things. One, the problem of tech that you're bringing up now, and then two is that the the professionals are not trained on how to use this technology in any way whatsoever. So they're blundering a lot of it. Like my dad struggles regularly with this. And he's 62. He never used tech in his life. He's very old school. He didn't need to use it for work, right? And all of a sudden, there's a ton of expectations for this bottom line to enter everything. And it takes him more time to finish tasks. And he's spending more time dealing with technology and the bureaucracy of it than actually working with the kids. And he's in special ed, as an example. So I'm seeing this firsthand on the field and with the practitioners.
And it's the lie of convenience, right? It's death by convenience, where essentially, here's 10, 15 different tools you now have to manage that are supposed to make things much more streamlined and easy. They don't. They shift more labor onto teachers, and they're generating data and information for someone else's profit, but they're not helping kids and they're not helping teachers.
Yep. I think that's a mic drop right there. And I think we're good. I think
Excellent.
well, it needs to be said. Thank you very much. I appreciate your persistence to come here after the laptop and go through everything very quickly but succinctly and beautifully. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it. And yes, my apologies. Thanks to everybody who stuck around for it. I do appreciate it. And yeah, please reach out. I've been enjoying connecting with folks all over the world. And so we do want to help. We're right and we're going to win.
If you want, you can go to the slide with your email address and phone number in the beginning again.
And we do that.
You can leave it up there for a few minutes as people head out.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks a lot, John. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, y'all.